military aid from the West.
Gordon Carrera reporting. Well, let's dig a little more into that. With us is the retired Major General Mick Ryan. He's in Canberra. He served for more than 35 years with the Australian Army and was most recently the commander of the Australia Defence College. General, thank you very much for being with us. You've written a very interesting thread on social media today about the Russian invasion and how it unfolded. Plan A, you said, was the cheap and fast route. That Ukraine would fall in a matter of days. Plan B was the creeping multi-axis attrition. Commit all the troops, hope they buckle. And they haven't. So what is Plan C?
Oh, thanks. It's good to be with you today. I think it's fair to state that there's nothing special about Putin's special military operation. It's actually quite ordinary, quite unimaginative, brutal and unnecessary. So they haven't succeeded in the quick plan. They haven't succeeded in the slow attrition plan yet. And it's doubtful whether they actually will in the medium to long term. So they're moving to what I've called Plan C, which is seeking to surround or try to surround large towns and cities and pummel them and destroy them and to terrorise the citizens in the hope that the Ukrainian government might come to some political accommodation with Russia.
A lot of people have questioned why Russia was so unprepared for this war. I mean, and you take it, in your comment, you take it all the way back to the reorganisation and the restructuring of the Russian military post-Cold War. They spent billions, and maybe they got the balance of that spending wrong. Maybe there was no one around President Putin who was going to tell him they got it wrong.
Now, they're very good points you've just made. They spent hundreds of billions reforming their military after their Georgia operations in 2008. And it's quite possible that the objectives they've set for this transformation program and the management of that program, both by the military and their defence industry, has not been up to speed. And as we're seeing, what they've written about and talked about in the decade before this operation has not matched their battlefield performance.
You could kind of understand that if you were the defender, but they are the aggressor. And setting aside the sophisticated military kit that they could have bought, that they could have integrated with other systems, the kind of help they're actually requesting from China is MREs. It's food. It's the most basic of logistics, which for a military planner like you, for someone who studies military advances, must be quite extraordinary.
In one respect, it is. I mean, it is one of the most basic things you provide for your soldiers. You never let your soldiers go hungry. I know the British Army doesn't, and I know our Army doesn't. But just remember, if the Chinese are providing food for the Russians, that means the Russians can spend money on other things like bullets and bombs.
Can I ask you whether you think there is someone around President Putin now who's prepared to tell him how the war is going?
I can't put my hand on my heart and say I have good knowledge of who's giving him good advice and who's giving him poor advice. But if there is someone who's giving him good evidence-based advice, there's no evidence that President Putin is actually listening to that or acting on it. He appears to be getting more desperate and more frustrated, which we see playing out in the more destructive approach of the Russian forces.
Rose Gottmiller, let me bring you in on this. I heard a fascinating statistic today from the US Admiral James Stavridis, who we have on the programme from time to time. He said that America sent some of its best troops to the Iraqi city of Fallujah in 2004 to clear out the city. It's 1/10 the size of the Ukrainian capital, and it took them 2 months. So what does that tell you about the number of troops and the time that it's going to take for Russia to take Kyiv?
If you have determined resistance, as the Russians will face in trying to take Kyiv, it can take one heck of a long time. And I think that many of us believe that we are seeing now, perhaps, if the Russians do succeed in surrounding and taking some of the larger cities, we are seeing the birth of a Ukrainian resistance that will take hold and no doubt will, I think, take hold and continue for a number of years. So the Russians will not be able to pacify Ukraine, in my view. And so it may be why we are seeing more attention to diplomacy at this moment, that both sides are beginning to think that they need to figure a way out of this mess. And even Putin himself seems to be changing his conditionality about coming to the negotiating table. So I take that as a small good sign.
Yeah, and that's perhaps, General, because, as you've explained, they're already at Plan C. Have you given it some thought what it would take to capture a city like Kyiv? Army people like yourself often tell us that urban warfare is hell, but when you've got a determined force like the Ukrainians, who can hide, who know all the back alleys, it could take them forever.
It is an extraordinarily difficult military and political task to surround and then seize a city. I mean, the Russians have had huge amount of difficulty around the second largest Ukrainian city, Kharkiv, in the east. That's much closer to their Russian supply lines, and they have not been able to surround it totally, and they have not been able to capture it. Kiev is a much, much larger challenge, and it's extraordinarily unlikely they'll be able to surround it, let alone seize it quickly.
Rose, the news that we got today was that the NATO leaders will be meeting in Brussels on the 24th. It's an extraordinary meeting that they've called. What do you think is on the agenda? Because I can't imagine they would be meeting all together were it just about continuing supplies or continuing the format that we have at the moment. Do you think it goes beyond that?
Yes, but first, if I may just mention that the one city that the Russians did capture, Kherson, you can see in news programs that the Ukrainians are still out on the street protesting openly against. So it just goes to show what the general had to say, that these kinds of efforts to subdue cities are very, very complex and difficult. As to the meeting at NATO headquarters on the 24th of March, I do believe, first of all, it will be a show of support, just as we saw a show of support from the three prime ministers today in Kyiv itself, but it will be a strong show of support by NATO. And I am hopeful by that time that there will be some thinking being put into how to unwind this conflict. As I said, there are some small hints out there that quiet diplomacy is going on that may have produced some results by that time, and thinking ahead about where we need to go to unwind ourselves from this terrible conflict and then begin to rebuild the structure of European security. That could be a topic for discussion as well. But I know that NATO leaders will also want to redouble their efforts to continue the supply not only of armaments, but also humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. So that topic will not be avoided. I'm quite sure of that.
General, just before I let you go, it does fit. I mean, Rose talks about bringing the war to an end, but it very much seems to me, in mind of what we've already talked about on the programme about China, that we're very much at a seminal moment here. It could go one way, where we have the Russian-Chinese axis splitting away from the West. We could be at a real moment in history here. And if that happens, that has huge security strategic concerns for Australia. How would that be viewed by the government in Canberra?
Well, I think that's one possible future, but I think we're a little way from some Russia-China axis taking on the world. I think we're a long way from that at this point in time. And indeed, my sense is the Chinese are a little embarrassed by the incompetence and the brutality that the Russians have shown in Ukraine. Notwithstanding that, the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party in particular has made it very clear they have designs on a little democratic island 180 kilometres off their coast called Taiwan. They will be learning a lot from Russian operations around the political dimensions and the military dimensions of any future operation against that island.
And Ed Vaizey, this is where the politics comes in, because the messaging at this moment is crucially important. What sort of messaging should the British government be sending right now?
Well, I agree with the General. I don't think an axis of Russia and China is going to happen. I agree with his analysis of what the Chinese probably think of the Russians' behaviour, which I said earlier in the programme. I think the British, obviously, I think the British government has done all the right things during this conflict in terms of supporting the Ukrainians. We've been training them since 2015. And I think if you see it through the prism of European politics, I mean, we've had this fissure caused by Brexit, but this has, I think, brought the European continent back together. And people are even, David Frost, the famous Brexit negotiator, in a speech tonight, talked about potentially supporting the idea of a European Security Council, which was proposed by President Macron. The idea of a European army has always been a sort of anathema to the British, but a strong, strong European security cooperation where the British do have a great reputation, which hasn't been damaged by Brexit, alongside the rearmament of Germany, and support for that are the kind of things that we should be talking about, because the key point to get across is that if there is a negotiated peace, and I hope there will be, that is the end of the beginning, as it were. Europe has to now redouble its vigilance and secure its NATO borders. And Britain and the European Union can be very strong partners in that.
Major General Mick Ryan, we're very grateful for your time this evening on the programme. We hope you'll come back and talk to us some more. Fascinating talking to you.
Thank you.
President